Over the last year, I have spent a ton of time playing Honkai Star Rail, and as a result, I've picked up a bunch of tips and tricks that I thought might be helpful for making the most out of your gaming experience. Whether you're a new player or you've been playing since day one, I hope that this will be a helpful look into the inner workings of Honkai Star Rail, as well as how to take advantage of everything the game has to offer. Before I hop into this gameplay guide, I want to note that this video reflects my own observations and suggestions. So if you deviate from that, or you have different approaches that work better for you, that is perfectly okay. I don't want to discourage anyone from playing this game the way that they want to. Instead, I hope that this video serves as a helpful reference, or just a simple refresher for different game mechanics that you'll encounter. I have tried to make this video as comprehensive as possible, but that has also made it very dense, so please take this at your own pace. Don't feel like you have to memorize anything, and know that there are a ton of timestamps, so you can skip around as you like, or you can always return to this later. With my preamble now out of the way, let's dive into the gameplay of Honkai Star Rail. Throughout your playthrough of Star Rail, you will regularly fight battles against a variety of in-game enemies, either by attacking enemies directly in the overworld, or by spending energy in domains. Every 24 hours, you will accumulate 240 energy that you can spend. But do know that if you aren't able to log in for whatever reason, Star Rail will just store all of your excess energy up to 2,400, or the equivalent of 10 days, without being able to play the game. Whenever you are able to log in again, you can just withdraw whatever you need and get started from there. But regardless of whether you're fighting an enemy in the overworld or in a more specialized game mode, the following sets of rules will always apply. You will control a party of 4 characters that will fight against a group of 1 to 5 enemies. There can never be more than 5 enemies on the field at any time, so even if an enemy tries to summon reinforcements, the maximum that you will need to fight is 5 at any given time. The goal of every battle is to defeat the enemy combatants, either by dropping every enemy's health to 0, or, if you're in a boss battle, dropping the boss's health to 0. Every enemy has 2 relevant status bars above their heads. The bottom red bar indicates the enemy's total health, and when it is completely depleted, that enemy will be defeated and disappear from the battlefield. However, enemies also have an additional white bar above their heads, which is called the Toughness bar. This bar can only be depleted by the enemy's elemental weaknesses, meaning that if you deal the correct type of elemental damage to an enemy, a significant chunk of that toughness bar will be depleted. Star Rail will always tell you what an enemy's weaknesses are by displaying those elemental symbols above their head, which is absolutely spectacular. Not only this, but if you target an enemy with the correct elemental weakness, the toughness bar will start glowing to indicate how much will be depleted by your attack. If an enemy's toughness bar is completely depleted, they will take a blast of damage and become broken, which will delay their next turn. Breaking an enemy will also grant additional debuffs depending on what element broke that toughness bar. Within Star Rail, there are 7 different elements, which will inflict the following debuffs when they break an enemy's weakness. If an enemy's toughness bar is broken by wind, fire, lightning, or physical damage, they will be inflicted with a damage over time debuff, or a dot debuff, meaning that the enemy will not only take damage when they are first broken, but they'll also take additional elemental damage at the start of their next 2 turns. This can be great for stacking up damage and making sure that enemies continue to take damage once they recover. As a side note, some characters can inflict those damage over time debuffs without breaking the toughness bar, which can be a huge boon during the course of a battle. Damage over time debuffs are called Wind Shear, Burn, Shock, and Bleed. So if you see that a character can inflict any of these status conditions during battle, it means that they will deal damage over time debuffs even when an opponent isn't broken. If an enemy's toughness is broken by quantum damage, the enemy will fall into an entanglement state. Every time that this enemy is hit while they are entangled, they will accumulate stacks of damage up to a maximum of 5, which will explode once the enemy recovers from entanglement. Quantum characters can be devastating combatants for this reason, as broken enemies can take on substantial damage from this entanglement. If an enemy's toughness bar is broken by ice damage, the enemy will become frozen, which will just skip their next turn entirely. This is a spectacular ability, as blanking an enemy's turn can give you more chances to damage them without getting hit in return. Abilities that let you freeze targets can be very powerful for this reason, and are well worth using if you have them available and want to give it a try. Last but not least, if an enemy's toughness bar is broken by imaginary damage, the enemy will be suspended within an imprisoned state, which will delay their next turn and reduce their overall speed for an additional turn. Although this isn't as damaging as Quantum, this is still fantastic for delaying an opponent's next turn and making it harder for them to get back onto their feet again. After an enemy has recovered from being broken, their toughness bar will recharge to full, allowing you to work on depleting it again and stacking more debuffs. Although you can defeat enemies without depleting their toughness bars, it is substantially easier and more rewarding if you do deplete their toughness bars. So making sure to hit enemies with the right elemental attacks is the core to your basic strategy. Characters have several different ways of dealing this elemental damage to their opponents. Regardless of their class, every character has a basic attack that will deal a small amount of damage to a single target. And this basic attack does not cost anything to activate. In addition to a basic attack, each character also has a skill, which requires a skill point in order to activate. Skill points are shared across the entire team, and you can accumulate up to 5 skill points for your team at a time. As a side note, some characters can accumulate more than 5, but they are very rare in the game. When a character uses a skill instead of their basic attack, they will consume a skill point and activate a more powerful ability. For damage-dealing characters, consuming a skill point could allow them to deal a higher-powered strike to a single enemy, depleting most or all of that enemy's toughness bar in one hit. For other characters, consuming a skill point may deal AoE damage to 3 to 5 opponents, breaking multiple toughness bars all at once. If the character is a healer, activating their skill can allow them to heal a nearby ally, whereas for tanks, consuming a skill point can provide shields and defensive buffs. If your skill points ever run out, your characters won't be able to use their skills until you regain more points again. But thankfully, using a character's basic attack will regain a skill point for your whole team. As a result, you'll want to use a mixture of basic attacks and skills from your characters to keep your skill points up as much as possible. The only exception to this rule are characters whose basic attacks themselves are enhanced by their skill. These characters will not regain a skill point when they use their basic attack. Thankfully, there are only a small number of characters who can even modify their basic attack, so in the vast majority of situations, using a basic attack will regain skill points. You'll just want to keep an eye out for these characters if you do want to run them. So far, we've talked about how to deal damage to your opponents with basic attacks and skills, but there's still some important fundamentals for us to cover. In particular, you and your opponents will take turns dealing damage to each other, and the order of these turns will be shown in this menu in the upper left corner of the battle screen. Each of your character's turns will be represented by their portrait and a blue indicator, whereas each enemy will be represented with their portraits and red indicators. Whoever is at the top of this menu will be the first to act, and during the course of a fight, you and your enemies will not only be fighting to win, but you'll be trying to manipulate this turn order to your advantage. One of the easiest ways to manipulate turn order is to deplete an enemy's toughness bar, as this will delay their turn and give you more chances to deal damage to them. The other big way to manipulate turn order are characters' ultimates. In addition to basic attacks and skills, every character also has an ultimate, which charges up during the course of a fight. These ultimate moves are a character's most powerful ability, and when they are activated, they will immediately take the next highest priority in the turn order, which is a powerful way to disrupt your enemy's turns. On top of disrupting the turn order, ultimates can deal an enormous amount of damage from DPS characters, whereas for healers, supports, and tanks, their ultimates could massively heal, buff, or shield your team from attacks. Although characters share the same pool for their skills, character ultimates are all charged up individually, as the total energy required to cast their ultimates vary from character to character. However, by and large, the ways to charge up these ultimates are the same, regardless of the character. Using a skill will charge a huge amount of energy for ultimates, whereas basic attacks, defeating enemies, or even getting hit by enemies will also charge up energy for a character's ultimate. Essentially, all the actions that you'll already be doing during battle will charge up your ultimates, which helps to streamline battles considerably. Deciding when to unleash an ultimate and how best to recharge it again is a fun challenge throughout the course of this game. And the more that you play with your characters, the faster you'll get at determining how to chain ultimate attacks to further disrupt your opponent's plans. Outside of skills and ultimates, some characters can also utilize what are called follow-up attacks, which will trigger separately from your character's action and will have their own action in the turn order. Only a small number of characters have follow-up attacks, but it's a fun layer of complexity if you do want to utilize these characters for battle as well. Most notably, however, is that even if you don't run follow-up attackers on your team, some enemies in the mid to late game will use follow-up attacks of their own, so it is always to your advantage to keep a close eye on the turn order to anticipate attacks during a battle. Thankfully, your opponents cannot use ultimates, so it's just skills and follow-up attacks that you have to worry about. We've talked about how combat actually works, but combat is something that you have to initiate. You will do this most of the time in the game's overworld, where you can run around and attack enemies to plunge into battle. On top of this, you can always tell what elemental weaknesses an enemy will have by looking above their heads, just like you would in combat. You can then use a basic attack on that enemy in the overworld to launch yourself into combat and automatically deplete some of that enemy's toughness bars. So make sure to try and target enemy weaknesses in the overworld as well. And with that, we've covered all of the combat fundamentals. Let's talk more about party composition and character classes. Outside of combat, deciding who to put on your teams and how best to optimize those characters is an important challenge of the game. In Star Rail, characters are categorized by the type of elemental damage that they do, as well as what path they follow. But this can be very fluid when it comes to team building, so I'm going to try to simplify this as best as possible into the following classes. Single target damage dealers are characters who will always deal single target damage, even when you use their skill or ultimate. But the trade-off is that when they do deal damage, they will deal massive amounts of it. As of patch 2.1, these are all the single target damage dealers in the game. AoE damage dealers are characters who will deal damage to 3 to 5 enemies when you activate their skill or ultimate, allowing you to chew through huge swaths of enemies all at once. AoE characters are great for breaking a large number of enemy toughness bars at the same time. And even though their raw damage numbers aren't as high as single target damage dealers, they can still be just as powerful for clearing content by applying and utilizing debuffs. These are all the AoE damage dealers that are currently in the game. Mixed damage dealers are characters who do a mixture of AoE and single target damage, which gives you a little bit of both worlds. These characters excel in circumstances where you need flexible damage dealers who can help chew through toughness bars and stack powerful debuffs onto a single target. At the time of writing, these are all the mixed damage dealers that are currently in the game. Supports can do small amounts of damage during a battle, but their primary utility is providing massive buffs to your team to maximize their damage. Some support characters will charge a character's ultimate energy, while others will massively advance a character's actions forward in the turn order. These are all the support characters that are currently in the game. Tanks are invaluable for survivability on your team, as they are not only sturdy additions to your party, but they will draw enemy fire away from your other characters to keep them up and standing. Tanks can also improve your team's survivability by providing shields to your allies, or tanks might activate skills that simply reduce the damage that your party members take from enemy attacks. As of patch 2.1, these are all the tanks that are in the game. Last, but certainly not least, healers are your last line of defense during a battle, as they can provide emergency healing while also cleansing dangerous debuffs from your characters. Some healers can even serve as mini supports by increasing damage and ultimate energy for your party members, which is fantastic. These are all the healers that are currently in the game. Although some content is technically playable with just damage dealers and supports, for the vast majority of the game, I would highly recommend having at least one tank or healer on your team, and preferentially both to maximize survivability. Even as a max level player, I still run a tank and a healer on most of my teams because enemies deal a lot of damage with more debuffs and status effects. So make sure you run at least one tank or healer for much of the game's content. As for how you pick which supports and damage dealers to run, this is where the world is your oyster. We'll talk more about skills, abilities, and stats in just a brief moment here, but I do want to mention that you can make so many fun combinations of characters. So more than anything, just have fun experimenting with different pairings of supports and damage dealers. Some of my teams have one damage dealer and one or two supports, but I have a bunch of teams with multiple damage dealers to maximize elemental synergies and enemy debuffs. My biggest advice is to play the way that you want to, and to enjoy building fun teams with different synergies. The only thing to keep in mind is that you'll want at least one character that provides survivability to your team. But you can still have fun with who that is and how you want to build them alongside your other characters. As a side note, if you're coming to this game from Genshin, do know that there is no elemental resonance in Star Rail, so you don't have to run multiple characters with the same element on your teams. In fact, it's often better to run multiple different elements to make sure that you can break different enemy weaknesses. But there's also some spectacular mono-element teams in the game, so just know that there is a lot of flexibility in how you build your teams. But how do you go about deciding who to run and what skills will synergize with each other? The best way to do this is to dive into each character's abilities, which you can find in the character details screen. In addition to each character's stats, you can also click this option here to see a character's abilities and learn more about them. As we talked about earlier, every character will have a basic attack, skill, and ultimate. But on top of this, every character also has 2 additional abilities. One of these abilities is called a talent, which you can essentially consider a passive ability. A character's talent will be activated automatically during the course of a battle, and it can provide additional buffs or synergies with a character's other abilities. Talents are extremely powerful, especially since they're automatically activated during combat, so learning about them can help you see additional strengths that your characters may have. On top of talents, every character will also have a technique. Before you initiate a battle, you can select your active character's technique, which can have a multitude of different effects depending on which character is activating it. Some character techniques can increase the potency of your character's abilities, while others will launch a surprise attack at an enemy to start combat with an even greater advantage. Using a technique before battle consumes 1 technique point, and your team shares up to 5 technique points at any one time. These technique points can be refreshed in the overworld by breaking purple storage containers, which will refresh 2 technique points at a time. You can check how many technique points, as well as which technique will even be activated, by looking at this icon in the lower right-hand corner when you're running around in the overworld. Here are all the types of techniques that you can use. Enhanced techniques will buff your character, making them even more powerful when they start battle. You can use enhancement techniques without being nearby enemies, and most enhancement techniques will last indefinitely until you initiate battle. Defense techniques will provide defensive buffs for your team, either providing automatic shields at the start of battle or enhanced defensive stats. Just like enhancement techniques, defensive techniques don't require you to be nearby an enemy, but some defensive enhancements have a limited duration before they need to be reapplied, so make sure to use them right before a battle. Repair techniques are the specialty of healers, and they ensure that you'll have healing-based buffs once a battle begins. Although they're not quite as powerful as enhancement or defensive techniques, repair techniques are still valuable for difficult battles and are well worth using if you want to keep your team the healthiest they can be during a boss fight. Impair techniques can be used to debuff your enemies before a battle begins. However, unlike the previous techniques, you must be nearby an enemy in order to properly utilize them, so make sure that you're in targeting range of an opponent before you utilize an impair technique. And finally, attack-based techniques will launch an attack on the nearest target when you activate them, depleting a portion of your enemy's toughness bars before the battle even begins. This is very similar to attacking an enemy's weakness with a basic attack before battle, but attack-based techniques will do substantially more damage than a basic attack. So if you do have one available, you can just activate an attack-based technique instead of using your basic attack. Just like with impair techniques, you'll want to be within striking range of your target before you activate these techniques, but they can be massively influential for starting a fight off on the right foot. If you're having trouble keeping track of which techniques do damage and which ones do not, just look to see if there is any text listed below the technique icon. If there is text, then a technique will buff your team or debuff an enemy, whereas if there is no text, the technique will launch an attack instead. I would highly advise reading through the skills, talents, and techniques of your characters before you start building them, just to see what fun abilities they can unleash and how they could work with each other on your teams. Some character abilities will also reference specific stats, which will give you an idea of how a character will deal damage, heal, or provide support during battle. These are all the terms and stats that you may come across within your character's abilities. The HP stat directly reflects how much health a character has, but some healers, like Lynx and Natasha, as well as tanks like Fu Xuan, will scale their abilities off their total HP. A character's attack stat is a representation of how much damage they'll do in battle, but some characters will use attack scaling in their support abilities as well, such as Tingyun. Whereas HP represents a character's total health, defense is a measurement of how much damage they will resist during battle. tanks like Japard and the Fire Trailblazer also use defense to increase the strength of their shields. A character's speed corresponds to how quickly they'll act in the turn order and is a very important stat for all of your characters. Some characters will also use the speed stat for their skills, such as Hanya. Crit rate directly impacts how often a character will land a critical hit, and the damage from those critical hits scales off of a character's crit damage. Not all characters need to deal critical hits, but damage dealers will benefit greatly from increased crit rate and crit damage. The general rule of thumb is a 1-to-2 ratio for crit rate to crit damage. So if you have 50% crit rate and 100% crit damage, then you're in a good spot. However, some characters will want even more crit damage, such as Bronya and Sparkle, who use crit damage scaling for their abilities. Break effect increases how much enemy toughness bars are depleted by elemental attacks, but it is also used by characters like Ruan Mei and Shui Yi to maximize their skills. A character's outgoing healing refers to how much healing a character can accomplish on top of their HP abilities. Although this stat won't be referenced directly in most characters' abilities, you can think of outgoing healing as the total amount of healing that your character will do. So all healers benefit from increasing this stat on top of their HP. Although characters gradually restore energy for their ultimates during the course of a battle, you can speed up this process through the energy regeneration stat, which will recharge a character's ultimate even faster. Characters with expensive ultimates like Argenti, or characters who want to quickly recharge their ultimates, will benefit greatly from energy regeneration. The effect hit rate stat reflects how likely it is that a character will inflict a debuff on an enemy. On top of this, characters like Black Swan also use effect hit rate for damage scaling on their abilities. On the flip side, effect resistance refers to how likely a character is to resist an enemy's debuff. Although most skills won't directly reference effect resistance, it can be a great stat for tanks and healers to make them even sturdier against enemy attacks. And last, but certainly not least, is resistance penetration. All enemies will be more resistant to elements outside of their weaknesses, but resistance penetration can reduce that damage resistance for particular elements, meaning enemies will take more damage from that element. This also means that enemies that are weak to a particular element will take even more damage from that element if resistance penetration is involved, which makes this stat very powerful. Characters like Seela will massively reduce enemies' resistances to quantum damage, meaning that quantum damage dealers will deal even more damage to those enemies, whereas Silverwolf and Ruan Mei reduce enemies' resistances to all elements with their abilities, which is extremely powerful. And those are all the stats that you need to know in the game. Again, just as a reminder, those were a lot of different terms I talked about. Please don't feel like you have to memorize those. This is just meant as a helpful reference if you do run into those terms and you want to know what they mean. So feel free to return to this part of the video at any point just to review these. But don't feel like you have to memorize them by any means. Now that we've gone over what abilities and skills a character can have, it's time to level up your characters before you head into battle. There are several different components to leveling up your characters, so I'm going to try to break this down as best as possible. When you get a character that you want to play, the first thing you'll want to do is to level up their base stats. You can do this by clicking on this Level Up button in the lower right corner of the character detail screen, which will let you exchange experience material and credits to raise your character's level. These experience materials can be obtained from memory golden calyx domains, which are quick mob-based domains with low-level enemies. At certain levels, you'll also have to ascend your characters, which will require additional materials from stagnant shadow domains. These stagnant shadow domains are a little tougher than the memory calyx domains, as they feature mini-boss enemies, but they're surprisingly easy to grind once you get a feel for them. Character ascension will be required every 10 levels after your characters reach level 20, but they mark important milestones for your characters where they'll become more powerful and will unlock more options for their builds. As a general rule, if you're ever unsure of what material you need to level up a character or their equipment, you can click on the resources icon to see what it is and where to find it. For character ascension, you can also click on this magnifying glass icon in the upper right corner, which will display a series of diamond shapes, which you can select to see what resources will be needed for different ascension levels. As a reward for leveling up your characters past certain ascension points, you will also unlock additional gacha pulls, which you can claim from this menu as well. The maximum level that your characters can reach is level 80, although your characters will always be capped at your own player level. You can raise your player level and the level of enemies in your world by completing main story quests and something called equilibrium challenges, which will be made available at certain milestones during your playthrough. Once you've leveled up your character's base stats, it's time to focus on their light cone. For all intents and purposes, you can think of a light cone as a character's weapon. It will grant them stat bonuses that are important for damage and survivability, as well as unique weapon abilities that will make your characters even more powerful. Light cones come in 3 different rarity types: 3-star, 4-star, and 5-star. The main difference between these is that the base stats are the highest on 5 stars, but beyond that, the individual abilities that light cones grant all have various benefits for different characters. If you have 4 and 5-star light cones, it's generally best to equip those to your characters just for the sheer stats upgrade alone, but don't discount 3-star weapons if there is an ability that you really want your character to have. You can equip a light cone to a character by going to the light cone menu and selecting Equip in the bottom right corner, which will pull up a list of all of the weapons available to your character. Do know that characters can only equip light cones that correspond to their class or path, which will be highlighted with this fluorescent green color in the left-hand corner of each weapon. Don't worry though if you're red-green colorblind, there will also be a reminder in the right-hand menu telling you whether or not a light cone can be equipped to a character. The best advice I can give for picking light cones is to look over your character's abilities once again. What stats affect the scaling of their abilities? For example, the character like Gwynaifen will apply 2 debuffs to her opponents, so selecting a light cone that increases damage against debuffed enemies will increase her power even more. Once you've decided on a light cone to equip, you can select that equip button again in the lower right-hand corner, and then you can proceed to leveling up your new weapon. If you ever change your mind and you want to pick a different light cone, just click this switch option in the light cone menu, and you can reselect a new weapon. Once you're ready to level up your light cone, you'll select this Enhance option, which will bring up the Ascend menu to level up your new gear. Just like with character leveling, light cones can be leveled up to 80 and will have ascension milestones every 10 levels starting at level 20. The materials needed to level up light cones can be obtained by running Ether Golden Calyx domains, and the materials needed for ascension of light cones are obtained from Crimson Calyx domains. You can also use other light cones to level up your equipped weapon, but I would generally advise against this unless you're truly desperate. You may want some of those light cones for your other characters, so try to use other resources first before resorting to mulching 3-star light cones. If you ever happen to obtain multiple copies of the same light cone, you can fuse them together to enhance the light cone's effect. The maximum number of light cones that can be fused together is 5, and you can do this within the light cone leveling screen by clicking on the Superimpose button underneath the Ascend icon. Once you've clicked on Superimpose, you can then click on this plus icon to add up to 4 other light cone copies to your fusion. And once you've added however many light cone copies you want, you can click Superimpose in the lower right-hand corner to combine them all together. The newly fused light cone will have enhanced bonuses for its base ability, which will make it an even more powerful weapon. As a side note, if you try to superimpose 4 or 5-star weapons, you'll notice that they are locked by default to prevent you from accidentally mulching or deleting them from your inventory. If you want to unlock a 4 or 5-star light cone for fusion, then click on that light cone to pull up its details, then either select this lock icon to change it from locked to unlocked, or if you're using a controller, you can select the corresponding button on your gamepad to unlock the light cone for fusion. From there, you can superimpose it as normal and create a more powerful weapon. After you've leveled up your character's base stats and light cone, it's time to improve their abilities through the skill tree. You can access the skill tree through the Traces menu, right underneath that light cone menu. And this is where the real magic begins. You'll not only be able to upgrade individual skills, talents, and ultimates in this trace menu, but you can also upgrade your character's base stats, as well as unlock brand new passive abilities through this menu. You can level up skills and abilities in this menu by spending resources from the Crimson Calyx domains, which are the same ones that you'll be grinding for light cones. If you want to unlock new passive abilities in this menu, you can do so when your character reaches levels 30, 50, and 70. These passive skills do a huge variety of things. In fact, these passive abilities are so powerful that I would recommend leveling your characters past 70 in order to unlock and acquire these passives, since they can hugely swing the course of a battle. Once you do meet the requirements of hitting levels 30, 50, or 70 to unlock these passives, you can activate them by using materials from Crimson Calyx domains, as well as a new game mode called Echoes of War. Echoes of War is a different game mode that pits your team against a powerful boss from the main story. Echoes of War is one of the only game modes that limits the number of runs that you can make every week. But thankfully, each Echo of War domain drops just one type of resource. So as long as you complete the Echo of War boss fight, you'll get whatever resource it is that you're looking for. I'd recommend trying to run Echoes of War at least twice a week until you have 10 to 15 of each resource type, which will be more than enough to level up multiple characters. One quick note about gathering resources for leveling. In addition to obtaining them from domains, you can also turn lower level resources into higher level resources by accessing the Omni Synthesizer. This is a fantastic way to get around grinding domains. You can access the synthesizer from the main menu, or you can access it by clicking on a resource and then selecting Omni Synthesizer to teleport you to that menu. If you ever feel overwhelmed trying to figure out how to build a character, or you want to see advice on how other players have built their characters, there are a ton of great content creators that have put together extensive guides on this exact subject. My number one resource for building characters is the website pridwin.gg, which has been a huge help for looking over potential character builds and theory crafting. On top of this, the YouTubers Sevi Plays and Moonverse also have some fantastic character guides, which can be really helpful for figuring out how a character works before you start building them. I think guides give invaluable inspiration on how to build characters, but I do want to note that you should always look at guides as a jumping off point rather than absolute gospel. More than anything, the most important thing is that you understand how your character works. And from there, you can either build your character similarly to the guide, or you may find that you have a different light cone or relic set that you want to try out. These guides are incredible and made tirelessly by these creators, so check them out to see how your characters work, and then you can decide how to build your characters from there. Okay, so we've gone over a lot of different ways that you can make your characters more powerful. But there is one last menu to talk about before we leave the character detail screen. The Relics menu. Before you feel too overwhelmed, I would say that the Relics menu is more of a mid to late game menu. It's not something you need to worry about when you're just starting out, since leveling up your character's base stats, light cone, and skills are more important. But by the time that you reach this nasty deer boss, it's probably time to start thinking about relics. Relics can be fantastic for powering up characters while also granting them more survivability, but they are also the most obnoxious type of equipment to obtain and level up. So let me walk you through how I approach relics and what has made this entire process considerably easier. Every character can equip 6 relics, 4 of which will be connected in an outer ring, and 2 of which will connect in the center of the relic menu. The 4 relics in the outer ring will have set bonuses, meaning that if you use multiple relics from the same set, you will get an additional passive bonus for that specific character. You should always prioritize set bonuses, so you can either pair 2 sets of relics together to get 2 different set bonuses, or you can have all 4 outer relics be the same set to gain a massive 4-piece bonus. You can look at the different sets and what their bonuses are by clicking individual relics and looking at their potential bonuses. The relics in the outer ring can be obtained from overworld quests and treasure chests, or by grinding Cavern of Corrosion domains. After selecting your 4 outer relics, you'll want to select 2 inner relics. Even though there is only 1 set bonus from equipping inner relics, these set bonuses are always extremely powerful. They will give massive damage buffs to your character, or in some cases, your entire party if you meet specific requirements. Making sure that you meet the requirements of the inner relics is hugely important, and also a deeply frustrating process, as it involves leveling up your relics to try and get the stats needed to meet those set requirements. Every relic has 1 main stat, which will be displayed at the very top of the relic's description, as well as 4 substats. Every time you level up a relic, the main stat will be improved substantially, whereas every 4 levels, only 1 of the substats will randomly be improved. You don't get a choice of which of your substats will be upgraded, and you only get a few shots at it since it only happens every 4 levels. This is the core of the frustration with relics, as it's completely random whether or not a particular substat will be leveled up. And even just getting a relic that has the main stat that you want can be an exhausting process. Leveling up relics and grinding for more relics is my least favorite aspect of Star Rail, but thankfully, there's a few things that make this much less painful. For one thing, the very first relic sets that you encounter in the game are not only fantastic for most of the cast, but you also end up with a lot of them just by playing through the story and running lower level game modes, which makes it much easier to find relics with main stats and substats that you need. For 4-piece sets in your outer ring, I would recommend the Musketeer of Wild Wheat for damage dealers, Passerby of Wandering Cloud for healers, Knight of Purity Palace for tanks, and the Thief of Shooting Meteor for supports. Whereas for your inner ring, you can use the Space Sealing Station for damage dealers, and the Fleet of the Ageless for healers, supports, and tanks. If you reach a point at the game where you want to try grinding for the more specialized relics, you'll be in a much better position to do so. But you can also just stick with some of these base relic sets even into the late game. In addition, while substats are certainly helpful for meeting set requirements, your main stats will have the most immediate impact on your character. So it's more important to prioritize main stats over substats. Thankfully, 2 slots out of your 6 relics will always have the same main stat. The head relic will always have HP as its main stat, and arms will always have attack. So this means you only have to worry about finding good main stats for your other 4 relics. You can choose a variety of main stats for your body relic and 2 inner relics, but for your foot relic, I would highly suggest speed as the main stat. Since speed affects how quickly your character acts in battle, it's just a good idea to increase speed to make sure your characters act before your enemies. As a result, I would highly suggest equipping speed boots on all of your characters and using other boots as leveling material. As a last resort, you can also remove some of the randomness from this process by crafting relics with the main stats that you want, which is absolutely incredible. If you reach level 40 on the Battle Pass, which you can do for free, then you will receive a self-modeling resin, which you can use to craft your own relics. I would note that self-modeling resin is still a very rare resource, so I would be careful what you spend them on, but they are incredible to use when you really need a particular main stat on a relic. You can use self-modeling resin to craft relics in the last tab of the synthesize menu, where you'll select exactly which relic you want to create and what main stat you would like it to have. Unfortunately, the substats will still be random, but this is still a great way to get relics with the main stats that you need. Lastly, just like with light cones, relics come in 3-star, 4-star, and 5-star variations. But unlike light cones, you can disregard 3-star relics entirely. This is because 4 and 5-star relics can reach much higher levels compared to 3 stars, with 4-star relics reaching level 12 and 5-star relics reaching level 15. As a result, I would only recommend leveling up 4 and 5-star relics, and you can just use your 3-star relics as leveling material. There are also technically 2-star relics, but you can just mulch those like the 3 stars. In addition to mulching 2 and 3-star relics, you can also use relic crystals to level up your relics, which can be obtained from completing missions or by running the simulated universe. And with that, we've finished talking about leveling up your characters. Next, let's talk about more specialized domains like simulated universe, pure fiction, and the Forgotten Hall. At long last, it's finally time to talk about simulated universe. Despite how much I despise grinding for relics, simulated universe is hands down my favorite game mode of Star Rail, to the point that I will often run it for fun instead of using it for relic hunting. The simulated universe takes everything we've talked about up to this point, all the careful leveling of characters and picking out what light cones, skills, and relics to use, and it gives you a playground to run those characters at their fullest potential. And not only this, but even if you're not hunting for relics, the simulated universe still has fantastic rewards, as every week you get more gacha pulls and crystals for leveling relics. You also get Herta bonds, which is a currency you can spend in the simulated universe store to obtain these absolutely spectacular 5-star light cones, which I have equipped on multiple characters. Honestly, I love Simulated Universe so much that this section of the video became entirely too long. I will try to very quickly summarize Simulated Universe here, but if you want to hear me talk more in depth about this game mode, I'll be hosting a Simulated Universe question and answer stream next week, so you can either swing by live or just watch how I approach this game mode. So, here is a quick summary of Simulated Universe. Throughout Simulated Universe, you will be challenged to defeat a series of worlds, which are essentially boss domains with difficult enemies and encounters to work through. Your mission is to complete all zones within a world and defeat that world's final boss. And you'll accomplish this with a combination of blessings and curios that you'll pick up during your run. You'll also be able to pick which path you want to follow during your run, which will give you unique buffs and abilities that you can utilize against your enemies. Shown on screen are my favorite paths to use during Simulated Universe, as well as the curios and blessings that I think are spectacular to pick up along the way. Every successful run that you make in Simulated Universe gives you ability points that you can spend on the Simulated Universe ability tree, which makes your characters even stronger in future runs. At the time of writing, there is a standard mode for Simulated Universe, as well as 2 expansion modules, which are considerably harder than the standard edition. Of the 2 expansion modules, I much prefer Golden Gears, since it has a lot of fun mechanics you can play with and not the horrible enemies of the Swarm Disaster, but both of them are still a ton of fun to grind through. In addition to Simulated Universe, the game modes Pure Fiction and the Forgotten Hall are also fantastic late-game content. In both Pure Fiction and the Forgotten Hall, the faster that you can take down your opponents, the higher your score will be. So these game modes incentivize lots of speed on your characters, as well as high damage capabilities. The first game mode, Pure Fiction, is all about AoE damage, as you'll have to clear through wave after wave of enemies that will spawn again and again to attack you. You'll be given several buffs to pick for your runs, which will help to carve through all these mobs of enemies. The second game mode, Forgotten Hall, is more boss-oriented, pitting you against difficult enemies that you'll have to defeat in a limited amount of time. Every Forgotten Hall level will have a special bonus that your team can utilize, which helps to carve through your opponents as quickly as possible. Unlike Simulated Universe and other domain grinding, both Pure Fiction and the Forgotten Hall have rotating content, meaning that you may not face the same enemies from one patch to the next. You will also have to create 2 separate teams with 4 characters each to complete Pure Fiction and Forgotten Hall levels, which can be very resource intensive. I'm going to be completely candid here. Even as a late game player, it can be difficult to run and complete these game modes, so don't feel like you have to stretch yourself too thin to complete them. If you enjoy the challenge of completing runs quickly and you have the raw damage and the speed to make that happen, then these game modes will be so much fun for you. But for your average player, don't feel stressed about completing all of these levels. It's okay to take your time grinding through the lower levels, especially since that will give you enough resources to purchase light cones from the Pure Fiction and Forgotten Hall shops. I've spent a lot of time in this video talking about how to play different game modes and level up your characters, but now that you have the groundwork for how to play the game, let's talk about how to actually obtain your characters. Within Star Rail, characters are divided into 4-star and 5-star characters. 4-star characters are much easier to obtain, as they can be unlocked just by completing events, main story quests, or by making rolls on Star Rail's Gacha system. 5 stars, on the other hand, can only be obtained from the Gacha system, which means we'll need to talk about how the Gacha system works and how best to interact with this system. Star Rail's Gacha system is unfortunately more complicated than other Gacha games like Blue Archive, but I'm going to try to break this down as best as possible. There are 2 types of currency for Star Rail's Gacha system: special passes and regular passes. The regular passes can be used at any time on the regular banner or the beginner banner. When you first start the game, this beginner banner is your highest priority, as you will always obtain a 5-star character within 50 pulls to start you off on the right foot. Once you have obtained your first 5-star character from that beginner banner, you can then turn your focus entirely to special passes, which are used on limited 3-week banners. Special passes will be the most important type of currency for you to accumulate, as these rotating banners will give you the most chances to obtain 5-star and 4-star characters in the game. You can still gradually throw polls at the regular banner to obtain 5 stars from a more limited pool, but your primary focus will be accumulating special passes for the limited special banners. The reason I'm emphasizing this is that most quests and daily rewards will not directly give you these gacha passes. You will instead get stellar jades, which can then be exchanged in the stellar trade menu for the passes. I really wish that Hoyoverse would change this, because it is so easy to accidentally select the wrong type of pass when you're exchanging currency. But that's why I'm making sure to emphasize this here. Once you have completed the beginner banner, only exchange your stellar jades for the special passes. You'll naturally gather regular passes just by playing the game. So once you're past the beginner banner, you only need to convert stellar jades into special passes. Once you've obtained those special passes, you'll notice that there are several banners running at once. At least one of these banners will be a limited 5-star character, and the other banners will be for a limited 5-star light cone. Unless you have lots of disposable income and time, I would generally recommend not pulling on the light cone banners. You simply don't need these light cones to play the game, and they're an easy way to waste your hard-earned special passes. For your average player, I would only recommend spending special passes on the 5-star character banner, as you'll still get some 4-star light cones from this, but you'll also have a chance at the 5-star character that you're actually interested in. Every banner has something called pity, which is the number of pulls you need to guarantee a 5-star character. In Star Rail, if you haven't pulled a 5-star character by your 90th pull, you'll have a 50% chance to obtain that featured character at your 90th pull. However, if you lose that 50-50 chance, you'll have one more chance within the next 90 pulls to obtain that character. On a practical level, what this means is that if you really want a character, you will need to have 180 pulls saved up, just in case you lose that first 50-50 chance to obtain them. Thankfully, this game is rather generous with how many pulls you can obtain, even as a free-to-play player, and on average, it will take about 3 months to accumulate 180 pulls, which is only 2 patches. To be honest, with how frequently characters get reruns, 3 months is very reasonable to save up 180 pulls to guarantee your 5-star character. But if you still want to chance it and make that 50-50 roll, please don't let this dissuade you from that. I just don't want you to feel tempted to spend real-world money that you might not have. If you're in a good financial situation and you want to support this game, then I would recommend the premium portion of the 6-week Battle Pass, which is also called Nameless Honor. It's the best bang for your buck, since it nets you a bunch of resources for leveling your characters, as well as more stellar jades for pulls. You can also just run the regular Battle Pass as a free-to-play player to get a bunch of rewards. Back to the banners themselves. If you ever happen to obtain multiple copies of a character during your pulls, you can unlock what is called their Eidolons in this part of the character detail menu. Extra character copies can unlock fun new abilities and passives, but they are not strictly necessary to play the game, so don't ever feel obligated to make more pulls than you need to in order to snag more copies of certain characters. That being said, if you really like a character or you really want to have extra copies and you have the pulls for it, then go for it. Just know that all characters in this game are playable right out of the box, and they are a ton of fun regardless. Beyond character building, leveling, and Star Rail's various game modes, I have some additional tips and tricks for making the most out of your playthrough. The Interastral Peace Guide menu is your best friend. It is where you find all the information on your dailies, which domains drop which resources, and it has teleport buttons for every game mode, which is way easier than manually searching for these areas yourself. In addition, if you're a new player, you should 100% play through this last tab for strategic training. It will go over everything we've talked about here while giving you more practice in combat. And even as a late game player, it can be a helpful refresher for how different mechanics work. Although you can obtain characters and light cones from gacha pulls, don't forget that there are tons of great light cones and characters available just from playing the game. You can unlock these 4-star characters from the game modes shown on screen, and you can obtain light cones from the Simulated Universe, Forgotten Hall, and Pure Fiction shops, as well as the Starlight Exchange store. Speaking of the Starlight Exchange, you can access that from the main menu by going to Store, and then it will be this option here. I would advise against picking up gacha pulls from this store, since it's better to save up for light cones that you want. But every month, you should absolutely pick up gacha pulls from the Embers Exchange, which is the option right below it. You can also get tons of resources for leveling light cones and abilities here, which is fantastic. So don't forget to check these menus every once in a while to see what resources you can pick up. When running domains, you can borrow characters from other players all around the world. I am obsessed with this feature as it makes it so much easier to grind for resources without needing to own every character. The only game modes where you can't borrow characters are Simulated Universe, Pure Fiction, and the Forgotten Hall. But everything else, you can and should borrow characters for resource grinding. Although combat is a huge portion of this game, the story is the heart of your playthrough, so make sure to complete the main story and to check out the delightful side stories. In addition to accessing these stories through the Missions menu, you can also click on this Fates Atlas option to see the entire story's timeline, as well as which events and side quests feature playable characters. The Events tab is another great resource for looking through all current events, as well as old archived events that you can still play through. Even if you missed these events the first time, they are archived in this conventional memoir tab within the Events menu, and you will still get rewards for playing these events, so make sure to do them. Messages are an extremely adorable look into the personalities and habits of the characters you've obtained, and you can sometimes receive messages that start quests and new adventures, so make sure to check your messages every once in a while. We've already talked briefly about synthesis for resources and relics, but you can also synthesize consumable items, which give massive buffs before you start a battle. You can only have one consumable item active at a time, so don't consume multiple before you begin a battle. But if you like having a little extra peace of mind while you're exploring the world, you can craft items within this synthesis menu. Assignments are another great way to get resources and are well worth doing anytime you log in. They also serve as one of your dailies, so it's generally a great idea to run assignments. Speaking of dailies, Star Rail does have dailies that you can complete for Stellar Jades, but this game is extremely good at respecting your time. So if you can't log in every day, that's completely okay. Just log in whenever you want and you'll have lots of energy to spend when you do. If you do log in to do dailies, my personal favorites to complete are assignments, spending 120 energy, breaking 5 enemy weaknesses, and using another player's support character. But you can also complete all your dailies just by making one successful run of Simulated Universe, so I tend to do that a lot too. My weekly routine generally includes consuming anywhere from 1200 to 1400 energy, and I prioritize Crimson Calyxes and Memory Calyxes throughout the week. I also make sure to run Echoes of War at least twice, and Simulated Universe anywhere from 2 to 4 times, depending on how much time I've got on my hands. If there are any story quests to complete or character conversations to read, I'll spend the rest of my time playing through those and enjoying the planets within the Star Rail universe. And with that, this is everything you'll need to know, and probably more, to dive into Star Rail and make the most of your playthrough. I absolutely adore this game, and I have wanted to make a video like this for some time, so I'm beyond delighted that this has finally come together. If you're looking for more fantastic resources for this game, one last content creator I want to shout out is Ying, who makes hands down the best pronunciation guides for character names. If you want to get better at pronouncing some of the names of characters in this game, I'd highly recommend checking out Ying's channel. Thank you so much for watching through all of this and making it all the way to the end. As a quick reminder, I'll be streaming Simulated Universe next week for anyone who wants to see how I approach my runs with different paths for both the standard and the expansion modules. Until next time, take care of yourselves and have a spectacular time trailblazing through the galaxy.